tell you, do we have a chance in this country to restore it back to what it was? We certainly do. You know, I'm inspired when I hear Officer Dalton talk, because he's an example of what's happening in our country today because of you folks reaching out with information to our law enforcement officers that Rick and I don't know. We've never met the officers that live in your area. Thank goodness at this time some of the people that live in your area, if you're from Las Vegas and some of these surrounding areas, some of these officers are on our mailing list. And so we've started the educational process that Officer Dalton and I went through, thanks to some citizen touching us with information and get us started on that course. So I'm just so proud of this officer, because he's bridged the gap that has been purposely laid between the citizens and the law enforcement officer, and he's come back to the side of the people, which isn't easy. And I want you to know he suffered in his police department. I don't know if he told you this, but I don't think he did, but the other day he told me, he says, "Jack, you know, my chief and I have something in common." He says, "We both reached the top in our career that we're going to reach." And it's because Rick probably won't make sergeant, he probably won't make lieutenant, because he's one of those officers that are kind of politically incorrect. You've been hearing that term, haven't you?
All right.
You know, but he's there, and he's constantly teaching other officers about that they serve the people. He's always watching other officers and being sure that they don't abuse the people. And so he's, in a sense, a thorn in the side of the New World Order, because, of course, they have plans for our law enforcement officers that you and I are not supposed to know about. The officers that were called peace officers just a few years ago have now been labeled as enforcement officers, and we are indeed more enforcers today than we are peace officers. And of course, as the progression towards this utopian society called the global society, the New World Order, progresses, we're going to see the enforcement officer play a bigger role in all of our lives. And we just hope and pray between each other that we can reach the masses of police officers in our country like Rick and I were reached and educated before that day comes. So I wanted to let you have some time with Rick so that you'd know that what you're doing is working. As you confront an officer on a traffic stop, instead of making that officer an enemy, which is easy to do, isn't it? Because you're mad. I know exactly the same feeling, because when I was a youngster, I used to get a lot of tickets. You see? And I hated it when a police officer would stop me. But the neat thing about it back then, they had a better attitude. You know, when I was growing up, the cop was your friend on the beat. He walked the beat usually, you know, and he knew everybody in the community. They didn't drive down the street in these cars with the tinted windows, with the sunglasses on, the air conditioner on, and the windows up. And it looked like that you are being supervised all the time as these cars go by, and you feel that these people aren't a part of the society. But Rick has bridged the gap, and many, many other officers are doing the same thing because you cared enough to touch them with something and take a few minutes with them and try to help them understand who they really serve. So I take my hat off to you folks for causing people like Rick and I to learn and come back to the duties and to serve the people and fulfill our oath that we took to you and to our country. Okay. Let's touch on now the LA riots and apply what Officer Rick Dalton talked to you about, the progression of force in the situation there. But I think the best way to start out, as some of you have heard me speak before about the importance of fear in our society as a change agent, almost is a good term, a change agent. One of the greatest is fear itself. Back in 1917, America was a fairly new country, and our growth was just unbelievable. Everything was going good in 1917. Matter of fact, further back in the early 1900s, the growth was tremendous. And a group of people decided if they were ever going to fit the United States into their scheme of a global society, they would have to cut the growth of the American people and cut the potential for the American people. And so at that time, in the early 1900s, we didn't have fear. There was no country that could come to us and attack us. We were strong militarily, we were strong economically, we were strong spiritually. And we had very little fear. And so our growth was just phenomenal. And so a group of people in New York City and Europe decided that they would have to create fear in the American people. And that was really the real start of using something called the Hegelian dialect that a lot of you know about. But for those that don't, I won't get into the whole detailed description of it, but it's something that has three parts. There's a thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis. And the way it works, simply put, is that if there's not a problem in the community and you want to change the people to think a certain way or react a certain way, you got to create a problem. And so in 1917, a group of people in New York and Europe decided that they would create a monster to scare the American people because we had no enemies that could threaten us. So they created the communist movement in the world. 1917, they trained 200 thugs to go to Russia and kill the Tsar's family and start the Bolshevik Revolution. They gave them millions of dollars, put them on the train, and got them out of here and got them over to Russia, and the Bolshevik Revolution started. And all of a sudden, America had an enemy. And these same people have seen to it that our tax dollars and much of our property, which is tax, money, our wages that we get as our property, a lot of us have paid to promote the Communist Party throughout the world, in the United States also, to fund it. Our farmers have fed the communists. And they built this monster up in those years to where we had a threat, and they could do all kinds of great things to push us because of our fear into this global mentality, that the only way the world's going to be safe from these type of enemies is that we all come together in one big happy family, love each other, and let the elite rule us so that we'll be happy, safe, and peaceful. The communists like to use the word peaceful. Well, let's take this to LA now. What happened in LA? We saw something that I'm sorry to say is not the first time that someone has been beat by police officers in this country. Not the first time at all that a person's been abused by law enforcement in this country. I have seen officers myself get mad and abuse prisoners. I've seen them abuse people in handcuffs. And of course they need to be reported by you and by me and any officer there, and many times they are, but far too often they are not reported and there's no investigation done. A video camera was in Los Angeles at that time and happened to get on film something that is far too common in our country today. Rick mentioned, of course, that when I use the word far too common, don't get the idea that a large percentage of our police officers abuse people, because they don't. I think that if we do not reach these officers, that we're going to see more abuse, because they're being trained to do things to the American public that they don't want to do and they're not going to like to do, but they're going to be told that they have to do it if they love America and they want to save this nation. And so we saw a person beaten. We were told that the officers felt that he was on PCP, so they had to beat him with batons to get him under control. But in our academy training, we all received the training that if a person's on PCP, you can't hurt them. They do not feel pain. So when myself and thousands of officers heard these officers get on the television and heard their defense being, well, we thought he was on PCP, so we had to beat him into submission. All of us knew that something's wrong with us, because they went through the same training we did. And if a person's on PCP, Officer Dalton's arrested them, I've arrested them, it takes a sufficient amount of manpower to physically overpower them so you don't have to kill them to get them arrested, because they don't feel pain.